So hi everyone, today we're going to be looking at how to create this login/register page for this side project that I'm working on. So here's a quick demo. And hopefully there's something for everybody in this video, because we're going to be looking at some front-end stuff. So first of all, React hook form, and that's to get some client-side validation. We're going to be using Nextjs as kind of like our API, so that's between the front end and the back end. And we're also going to be using simple JWT and Django on the back end. So here's a demo of just a quick form validation. So for example, if the username is less than 3 characters, then we just display that back to the user. And same thing goes for the register form. You can't see it probably because my face is blocking, but for the backend, we're going to be storing the refresh and the access token on the user's cookies. So that's kind of if you're more on the backend side of things. All right, so let's take a look at what we're going to actually do today. And the best way I think to go about that is just to draw out the different components, the different libraries, and how they're all going to interact with each other, so we can kind of better visualize what's going on. So let's start with our actual app, which is going to be a React app. So this is what the user sees and interacts with on the website, on the browser, or whatever. And within here we have we have a login and let's say a register functionality. So that's what we're focusing on today, letting the user be able to register and then using that registration to basically log in. And here is where we're going to need our first library, which we're going to talk about today, which is React hook form. And what React hook form does is it's useful for client-side validation. So that's kind of our first library we're going to look at, React hook form. And next up, we have 2 servers. We have a Nextjs server, and another server, or backend, I guess you can call it, is Django. And this is actually where we're going to write our backend code. So Django also has a database that we can basically save our users to. So here's the database, and it's going to be a Postgres database, but here's some kind of dependency. So here are our 2 servers that are linked to a database. Here's our app that's going to have some client-side validation. There's missing one key component, and it's how to connect the client side with the server side, because that's basically how the web works, right? The client sends a request, server sends responses. And the way we communicate between these two is by designing an API. So here's going to be our API. And the API is, again, some code that we write, which is going to handle logic from the client. So for example, let's go over the use case where the user actually tries to register. So basically they're going to submit their information, username, password, etc. They're going to click submit, which is going to send a request to our API. Our API is then going to have logic that is going to decide whether to send that request to our Nextjs server or to our Django server. In this case, it's going to be the Django server because we're dealing with creating models and users in the database, which Django is connected to. So it's going to receive the data the user sent. It's going to do like a double check. The backend always does a double check to make sure that React hook form and the user have entered the right details. And then if that is true and it succeeds, it's then going to create a user in the database. At this point, we're also going to create what we call the access and the refresh tokens, which we're going to dive into detail a little bit in just a little bit. But basically these tokens are going to be used to track whether the user is logged in and who they are. So those tokens will be generated here as well. Once the user is created, they will be sent back to the API. The API will send them back to the client, in which then we can store them in the cookies. And the reason why we store them in the cookies is because then they automatically get added to the headers for every subsequent request to these servers. So basically these servers will now always know which user is making what request. The first thing we're going to start building out is actually the backend side of things. And mainly we're just going to create 2 endpoints that can give us this access and refresh token. And the other endpoint will be used to get a new access token when it expires using the refresh token. And in case none of that makes any sense for you, I have a nice little graph that can quickly explain what is going on. So we have the client application, which will basically just be the browser or the user interacting with our app. And we have the authorization server, which will just be our Django backend. It starts with the user making an authorization request, which is to basically log in or register. If the credentials are correct, the server responds with that access and refresh token. The client can then store the access token and use it for subsequent requests. So access token, and then the resource server in our case is the same thing as the authorization server. So it's going to make a request while also accessing, giving the access token. And because they have the access token, the server will respond with that resource. But now the access token has expired. The client tries to make another request. The server responds with an invalid token error. And the client can now use the refresh token got in the very beginning to get a new access token and just repeat the process. So that's kind of the setup we're going to create now. Right, so how do we actually get this set up in our Django project? Well, luckily it's quite easy actually. If you go to the Django docs, they have like a bunch of different authentication options, and one of them is this simple JWT. So I'll just explain all of this in the code itself. But basically you can install at the very top this simple JWT, and the main thing that it does is it gives you these two views basically for free. So it's just code that they've written, which you can just import. So now we have two different endpoints that our API can hit to either get the token or get the token in the refresh, or just get a new token given the refresh. So yeah, these are endpoints that we can now hit, for example, just using any kind of API. So for example, if I have a user that's already registered with these credentials, I can hit the login, and then it will respond with the refresh and the access token. And if I have this refresh token and I make a request, then I'll get an access token back. And just like that, it's set up. Basically, it's only a settings thing and using the right packages. All right, so now that we got the backend set up, let's look at a typical like user flow. So most users will come in and they won't have an account. So they'll start with the register page. So let's take a look at how the register page would actually be built in code. So looking at the register form and touching on React hook form, which is to get that client-side validation, we can basically define a schema, which is what the form should look like and what are the constraints of each individual input. So for example, here's the schema. We have an email one, a password one, and a username one. And for example, if we look at the username one, it has a constraint that it needs to have a minimum length of 3. And if that's not the case, we can attach a message which is tailored to that specific error. So for example, the username must be at least 3 characters. And this way we provide kind of information to the user on what they're doing wrong in case they are doing something wrong, which I find very important in a form. It's like sometimes it doesn't submit, and it's nice to know exactly what is required from each form so you can actually create an account. And yeah, these kind of do the same thing, right? This .email makes sure that it's an email format, and this one makes sure there's 8 characters. So now we have this schema, which is basically defining what each input needs to look like. And we can use React hook form to handle most of the logic of the form for us. So for example, this use form hook comes from the library. It takes in basically what the form should look like. So that is the schema that we defined. It has different options like a mode and default values of the form. And the nice thing about React hook form is it comes with a lot of like pre-made functionality. So we can just call this form methods things to get back information about the form. For example, if it's valid. So that will be, it's valid based on what you defined here. And it can also find out if it's submitting. And the reason why this is useful is because we can disable the form or disable submitting the form if that's not the case. So now we can see this button is disabled if is submitting is true or if is valid is false. So now we've kind of prevented the user from like submitting bad data in. Not only have we prevented the user from submitting bad data to the backend, but we've also provided them with feedback if their inputs are incorrect. So we have these messages that we can use to send information to the user. All right, so now that we've actually used React hook form to do some client-side validation, and we've made sure that the user has actually given some correct data, how do we create the user and how do we use that access and refresh token paradigm? So basically, if the data is good, we're going to be calling this onSubmit function in the register component. What this function relies on is a create user function, which basically just calls our API client. Now, if you remember from the drawing we drew before, the API client is basically this API block. It's responsible for sending requests from the client to the server, right? So that's what this function does. And to break it down is if the user is already logged in / registered, we're going to get the access token and add it to the authorization header so that the servers can use them. If it's the first time, this if statement won't be run. and we're basically going to skip that part. And so then we're going to make our actual request to the backend to a certain URL that's provided in the register form. So here we're going to make the request to create a user basically. And then we're going to return that response if everything went well. But so here is kind of where this whole access and refresh token architecture is built. We check if the response from this request that we made is okay. If it's not okay, that means that the user was not authenticated, which probably means that the access token has expired. So basically, if the response is not okay, we do some error checking, not really important. We get to this if statement, which checks, is the status code 4.1, which means unauthorized? If it is, then we get the refresh token, make sure that they actually have the refresh token, and then we make sure that the URL isn't the actual one to get the token. And yeah, it's hard to explain why we do this, but the main logic is we basically check, is the user unauthenticated and do they have a refresh token? If they do, then try to get a new access token using that refresh token. So now we make another request to the backend, give the refresh token, get the access token. We then store the new access token and try to make the same request. So now we have the URL and we try to make the same request that we just did. So now it's going to go again to the back up to the top of this function. It's going to add the access token. It's going to make the request, but this time it has a proper access token. So it's going to skip this section and just return that data. So that's kind of how this like API client side of things works. And I also have some error handling, which basically lets me save errors from the backend that the front end might not be able to tell by itself. So the way I do this is I extend the error so that I can basically attach a status, a text, and some data to it. And then if I get an unauthenticated error or some kind of error, I add the status text that the server responded with, because this is the response from the server. And let's say it says like the credentials for the login are incorrect. I can just append that message here, so I have it available in the client. So that's kind of how this like API section works. And so that's how the register form, and in the login form it's very similar. We have this login function that makes a request with the API client, and if it succeeds, it stores the tokens. Right, so the last thing I wanted to talk about is how I actually changed the default behavior of creating a user in Django-rest-framework. So if you haven't checked out my video on Django-rest-framework explained, I would recommend you do that first. But basically, I knew that this create function is just belonging to some class that lives above this. So I just took the code in so I could make some changes, and I followed the way they did it. This is all Django-rest-framework code to create a user. But now once a user is created, I want some custom behavior to also return the access and refresh tokens. So what I do is I use the token pair that I got from the other package that I talked about earlier in this video to basically get the tokens and make sure that they're valid. And then I passed back the user as well as the token. And that's how I change kind of the default behavior of creating a user. So now when the user is created, it doesn't just return a user object, it also returns the refresh and the access token, which I can then store. So that's kind of basically it for this video. The final last thing I want to talk about is something I haven't fully understood actually myself, is how to, so I'm basically asking if anyone has a good idea on this, how to like not end up in like a try-catch hell. Because here I have this API client where I can't give it a return type because it's like there can be a network error, it can actually return the object. So I never know what's going to be returned from this API client. So I wrap it in a try and a catch. But then I want to also provide types to each request. So I usually wrap the API client in some kind of function, which is then typed. So it promises to return a login response or a login request here. But then should I also wrap this in a try catch? And then when I actually make the request in the login form, should I also wrap this in a try catch? If anyone has a good resource to like how try catch error handling works in general, that would be nice. But yeah, if you guys enjoyed this one, again, give me a like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more.